Just before we start, let me just give a comment about the cover. This is actually a photo from a store window in Toledo, which is selling Judaica today. My wife, Gloria Abella Balin, took the photo, and when you actually look at it in detail, it's layers of hiding, and there's also the mixture of both Jewish and Christian symbols that come into it. I'm Ron Duncan Hart on the Jewish Learning Channel to talk about this intriguing part of Jewish history. So let's get started. I've been doing research on crypto-Jews for more than 15 years, as well as teaching and doing invited lectures on the subject. During that time, I collaborated in organizing the exhibition Fractured Faiths about Spanish Judaism, the Inquisition, and New World Identities, which was at the New Mexico History Museum in 2016 and had a great success there, and some of you might have seen it. I also participated in writing and editing the award-winning book of the same title for the exhibit. Then a couple of years ago, I was approached to collaborate in the making of a documentary film, A Long Journey, The Hidden Jews of the Southwest, which is a Cine West New Mexico PBS co-production directed by Isaac Artenstein and produced by Paula Amar Schwartz and Mel Schwartz. It will have its premiere, by the way, in November, so you can be watching for that. As the film was being made, I was completing the writing of this book, and now it is a companion volume for the film on the experience of hidden Jews. Part of my motivation for writing this book was to address popular misconceptions about crypto-Jews and their history and give a baseline of historically and culturally correct information. So I wrote a book accessible to the general reader. Stanley Horthes, Seth Kunin, David Gitlitz, and others have written scholarly works on crypto-Jewish life, but my goal was to write an integrated account beginning with the history of Jewish conversions in Spain. Then I follow the migrations of their descendants to the Americas, where their lives continued into the penumbra of colonial America. Like the blind with the elephant, many of us know certain parts of this history, but this book, Crypto-Jews, connects these parts into an integrated narrative like the flow of history itself. How did my research on this subject begin? We were living in Colombia, and I traveled professionally to Cartagena with some frequency. And I usually stayed in a hotel near the Palacio de la Inquisition, the palace of the Inquisition, which is now a museum. As an anthropologist interested in Jewish history, of course, I visited the museum on multiple occasions. I had known about the Inquisition in Spain, of course, but this opened a door for me to understand more about it in the Americas, which had three primary sites: Mexico City, Cartagena, and Lima. Most of the Inquisition records in Colombia were destroyed, so my wife Gloria and I went to Madrid to the central archives of the Inquisition to find the copies kept there. There were copies. All of this is handwritten, by the way. So it was very interesting that there would be local copies and then another handwritten copy would be made and be sent to Madrid. Let me read from the book about the early experience in Madrid reading one of these cases of the Inquisition, the first one that I ever read. In quotes. 25 years ago, I sat in the Archivo Histórico Nacional, the National History Archives in Madrid, awaiting the first Inquisition trial transcript that I would read. It was of a midwife in her 80s who was arrested because she had been accused of washing the baptismal water off new babies. When they brought the inches-thick stack of handwritten parchment from 500 years ago, I sat in silence, contemplating what was on the table before me. A life in parchment, bound in ribbon. I saw the vulnerability of an 80-year-old woman whose years had been dedicated to bringing life into this world. And now the power of life and death over her rested in the hands of these inquisitors, who were the gatekeepers of Catholic conformity in Spain. It was her third arrest for the same offense, and normally that would have meant a strong sentence, punishment, and a prohibition against her acting as midwife for life. She was already 80, but she pleaded age and infirmity, and after a stern rebuke, her case was left in abeyance, not acquitted, but left like an open wound, a threat, a reminder of the power that could be reactivated at any moment. In thousands of cases against accused Judaizers in Spain and the Americas over the centuries, mothers and fathers were arrested because they did not eat pork, or maybe they took a bath on Friday. Maybe they did not work on Saturday. It was all to erase the taint of Judaism from Christian lands. There were over 20,000 arrests by the Inquisition for Judaizing, and the Dominican scribes of the Inquisition kept detailed, handwritten records down to the last screams of pain from the person being tortured. Written in the orthography of 15th and 16th century Spanish, I had to take a special course to learn to read the transcripts. Later, I continued that research in the Archivo de las Indias, Archivo of the Indies in Seville, Spain, additional research in the Institute of Anthropology and History in Bogota, Colombia, the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, University of Oxford, among other institutions, and there were others. Then we moved to Santa Fe, and I began to learn about crypto-Jews in New Mexico and the American Southwest. For me, it has been fascinating to do the research on Jewish conversos and crypto-Jews and discover the detailed organic linkages in these stories from Spain and Portugal to Amsterdam, London, New York, Cartagena, Mexico, Santa Fe. Let me distinguish between two terms here. I'll use the term converso to refer to anyone who converted, even though we might not know whether they were a true Christian or crypto-Jews still acting and thinking as Jewish. So conversos is a general term. The term crypto-Jew refers specifically to those who converted and that we have some evidence they were continuing Jewish practices. It is a compelling history of people and their movements, marriages, successes and failures, all under the shadow of one of the most pernicious anti-Semitic entities in history, the Spanish Inquisition. This book goes into detail about the historical context of these events. For example, how did the Spanish Armada in 1588 in the English Channel contribute to the settlement of crypto-Jews in New Mexico? And there was a connection. Or what did the Spanish defeat of the Portuguese in Recife, Brazil in 1630 have to do with Doña Teresa Aguilera y Roche, the only woman arrested by the Inquisition in Santa Fe? How did it all start? Spain had had the largest Jewish population in Europe. But in the 1300s and 1400s, anti-Semitism rose dramatically in that country, especially fanned by Dominican friars who focused on pressuring Jews to convert. And Dominican preachers such as Vicente Ferrer would come to a town and force the Jews together to hear his sermons, which denounced them as infidels. His fiery sermons stirred up Christian mobs who would then attack Jews with clubs and chains, destroying businesses and homes and killing people. And many Jews converted to save their lives during these attacks. So that's the process started like that and continued over a century, more or less in those terms. Vicente Ferrer also led the political effort to create laws against Jews in the early 1400s. in a pattern strikingly parallel to the laws the Nazis would pass in the 1930s. Jewish businesses were closed, Jewish children could not go to school with Christians, Jews had to wear identifiable clothing, and Jews were secluded into ghettos. As the number of Jewish converts living in Spain grew to the tens of thousands because of all these repressive measures, and then it grew to 100,000 and more, no doubt there were many thousands who were not loyal Catholics. We don't know the exact number of crypto-Jews, but obviously it was in the tens and tens of thousands. Heresy was intolerable to the Church, but even while this matter of false conversions was becoming more and more apparent, Dominican preachers continued the pressure on Jews to convert. Thousands of conversos became hidden or crypto-Jews, continuing to practice their Jewish tradition in secret. The psychological turmoil must have been profound for them, and they converted to save their lives and their families, but how many felt the emotional backlash of their actions later? Jane Gerber says, at what point does a converso stop thinking of himself or herself as a Jew? Since the Church did not teach them how to be Catholics, a converso might continue thinking of themselves as a Jew and observing traditional Jewish practices for years. After the expulsion of Jews in 1492, there could have been 100,000, maybe 200,000 conversos in Spain. And we can only imagine the number that might have been crypto-Jews because we don't know exactly how many there were. And I welcome you to have something for your throat. So, getting back to this, the Church saw false converts as a threat that had to be eradicated. And working together with the Spanish crown to solve the problem, the Spanish Inquisition was established to police converso behavior, in addition to the drastic decision of expelling the Jews. So what Jewish practices were these Jews in hiding able to retain? Stanley Hordes and David Gitlitz have worked on this issue particularly, as have some of the others, and they've documented elements of crypto-Jewish life in Mexico and New Mexico that we can actually see. The Jewish practices that survived were the home-based ones, mostly by women, because the public practice of Jewish life, which was the men's sphere, was forbidden. The synagogue, the rabbi, the Torah. So women emerged as particularly important in maintaining the remnants of Jewish life. And in many families, the memory of the Jewish heritage was passed down from mother to daughter, in part because they were the ones responsible for these home-based practices. Any family would not have necessarily observed all the practices that I'm going to mention now, but these are some of the ones that have been recorded. The most important one was observing Shabbat. Common practices in preparation for Shabbat were bathing, changing to fresh clothes, changing the bed, cleaning the house, and preparing the food for the day. And this seems to have been quite widespread in different parts of the Americas and crypto-Jewish families. Secondly, the central figures in crypto-Jewish veneration were Moses the lawgiver, Esther of stalwart faithfulness, and Job, the one faithful in spite of suffering and adversity. Dietary laws. The common practice was not to eat pork and to avoid the mixing of meat and milk in the same meal. In spite of not eating pork at home, some people would make displays of eating pork publicly, which I've always thought of as like a vaccination to prevent the Inquisition. There are also extensive reports about animals being slaughtered in kosher-like processes. Many families report lighting candles on Friday night with prayer. Early on, it seems that women did remember the Hebrew prayer, but by the 20th century, women in these families were still lighting the candles, but now saying Catholic prayers because the Hebrew had long been lost. In death rituals, in keeping with Jewish custom, the person who passed away was buried quickly after the body was bathed, wrapped in a shroud and buried in virgin soil. Mirrors were covered in the house. During the initial period of mourning, some families had the practice of putting sand on the soles of the feet of the deceased, symbolizing walking in the sands of Israel. Marriage, young men and women seem to have continued the practice of choosing marriage partners from within the crypto-Jewish network of friends. Circumcision was common among crypto-Jews in Mexico, surprisingly enough because it can be identified so easily. Inquisition records show that men arrested for Judaizing were checked to see if they were circumcised, and 80% were. I've read some interesting things in Inquisition records where the inquisitors were trying to understand whether a person was circumcised or not, and having some confusion as to what it actually meant. But 80% were recorded as having been circumcised. Observing the holidays. Yom Kippur was commonly observed with a fast in the classic Spanish crypto-Jewish life, and Yom Kippur was known as El Dia Grande, or the Big Day, and reference to it appears regularly in Inquisition records. Finally, fear of the power of the church was another characteristic of crypto-Jewish life. The phrase wearing the San Benito. The San Benito was an overshirt with different symbols on it depending on the person's status, that people that were arrested and convicted by the Inquisition had to wear. And it became an euphemism for being discovered as a practicing Jew and being punished. And the use of the phrase wearing the San Benito has continued into recent times, actually. Throughout the Spanish colonial period in the Americas, the lines between Jewish and crypto-Jewish communities were porous. And this has always been fascinating to me. People could switch between living as Jews or crypto-Jews depending on their location. A person could be born into a crypto-Jewish in Portugal, as Isaac Aboab de Fonseca was, then move to the Netherlands, for example, and return to Jewish practice. That was the case with many hundreds and into thousands of people. Others, like Paz Pinto or Lopez Mesa in Cartagena, had lived openly as Jews in Salonika and in Amsterdam before migrating to the Americas for business opportunities. But once in the Americas, they had to live as hidden Jews or crypto-Jews, even though they technically had never converted to Catholicism. So Jewish conversos who left Spanish and Portuguese lands to live as Jews, again in Amsterdam and elsewhere, were re-Judaized. They learned Hebrew, learned the prayers, and some even became rabbis. Early Sephardic settlers in North America also came from this background, such as the family of the businessman Aaron Lopez of Newport. Newport had several returning crypto-Jews that made up that population. Lopez had actually been born Duarte Lopez to a converso family in Portugal. His older brother had left Portugal for Newport earlier and returned to Jewish practice, and had changed his name to Moses. And in 1752, Duarte and his family followed in the steps of his older brother, moved to Newport, returned to Jewish practice, adopted Jewish names, and he became Aaron Lopez. So, and today, one of the interesting things that happens is that changing one's identity and sometimes the name has once again become part of the chain of experience of Catholic, converso, crypto-Jewish identity as people are returning to Jewish life from their Catholic past. The early Jewish communities in the United States, from New York to Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, from the 1650s to the 1850s, were largely Sephardic. And they included many Jewish converso families migrating from Portugal. Among the latter was the family of the most famous Jewish American poet, Emma Lazarus. The most famous Sephardic Jews of the 1500s and 1600s were people of Portuguese crypto-Jewish backgrounds, from Doña Gracia Nasi to Joseph Nasi, her nephew, Baruch Spinoza, maybe the most famous one, Menashe ben Israel, the emancipator of the Jews, Isaac Aboab da Fonseca, and then we have that lingering question that is stayed in history, what about Christopher Columbus? Maybe. A unique aspect of the story of the crypto-Jews is that it has a dichotomous structure. We have the beginning and we have the end, but there's a significant gap in the middle for our information. So I've divided the crypto-Jewish experience into stages to explain this gap in a way. The first stage that we have was in Spain and Portugal in the 1400s and 1500s. And that was a stage we might call classical crypto-Judaism. People remembered the prayers, still spoke Hebrew, maybe even had secret Torah scrolls. Many kept kosher, as well as observing Shabbat and the holidays. Some still lived in their hometowns and might have known other crypto-Jews and other Jews, and they were still remembered by their neighbors as having been Jews. So that was one experience. The second stage, which is mostly for their descendants who've migrated to the Americas in Mexico, Colombia, and Peru in the late 1500s and early 1600s, their experience began to be different. Most came for economic opportunities. They had been separated from active Jewish community life for a century or more by this time. In the Americas, there were no hometowns where they were known as Jews or had that experience. There were no Torah scrolls, and people had already become more assimilated to Catholic society. Moses had become Saint Moses by this time. Esther and Job were still venerated, and that could be done with little suspicion in a Catholic Christian society because they were in the Bible. We do know that there were clusters of crypto-Jewish families that observed Shabbat and the holidays, and in some cases held regular minyans. In Cartagena, for example, we have the documentation. We know where the minyan met. The house is still there. We know who was in the minyan. We have quite a bit of documentation on this. During this period, Spain was more interested, this is the early colonial period, Spain was more interested in building a Spanish elite to run the mining enterprises and the economies of these new colonies that were being consolidated. And there was, in essence, a don't ask and don't tell environment about Jews. There were repeated reports coming out of the port cities complaining about the number of Jews there. But at that time, the Inquisition overlooked it. Now, later, it would be different. But so the third stage, so here the second stage is late 1500s up to mid 1600s in the Americas. The third stage comes from 1650 onwards. It was during this time, as Spain grew afraid that crypto-Jews would ally with their enemies, the English and the Dutch, because the Dutch had successfully defeated the Portuguese and taken over Brazil at one point. The Spanish were terrified, in a sense, that they might lose some of their wealthy colonies to these emerging Protestant powers, the English and the Dutch, or one of them. And they imagined a grand conspiracy of Jews aligning with the English and Dutch to overthrow Spanish rule. So they activated the Inquisition for political purposes to arrest crypto-Jews for Judaizing and to break them up because they were afraid these crypto-Jews would be a fifth column against them. So they broke up the fledgling crypto-Jewish clusters from Mexico to Peru, arresting the leaders. and the survivors were driven deeper underground. What is striking is that the people today who are merging in those areas, identifying themselves as being from families with Jewish heritage, come largely from these areas in the Americas where there were the crypto-Jews in 1650. The fourth stage of this Jewish crypto-Jewish experience is the fourth stage, the one today. From 1650 to 1950, we have very little information. Starting in the late 1900s, we began to get this movement of people who have retained the memory of Jewish heritage in their family, even though they might have fragments of the Jewish practice, but the memory was still there, and people began to come out and talk about it. And that's the ongoing movement we see today. The Inquisition had decimated crypto-Jewish families in certain time periods, but it wasn't always active. And many times it was used more for political purposes than religious ones. So it was not always persecuting crypto-Jews. The most deadly period was 1480 to 1530, that first 50 years. Torquemada was during that time period. He set up the Inquisition. And in Spain, tens of thousands were arrested during this time period, and thousands were burned at the stake. It was a horrible time period. The Inquisition became less focused on crypto-Jews after 1530, but its reputation had been for cruelty and these awful events had been so established that it's continued to live until today. In Mexico in the 1590s, there was another small period of concentrated persecution of Jews. And it was during that time period that the Carvajal family was burned at the stake in Mexico, and an entire group of others. Then it skips from the 1590s, it skips to the 1630s and 40s. And that was the time of the fear of the grand conspiracy that I mentioned earlier. At this time, the Inquisition made a devastating roundup of crypto-Jewish leaders, essentially wiping out crypto-Jewish communities. No longer could it be a don't ask, don't tell. Now you had to really hide if you were crypto-Jewish. To understand a parallel from our own times, as I've thought about it, it was kind of like the McCarthy hearings in the House Un-American Activities Committee in the early 50s. But it went further because anyone suspected of being potentially disloyal to the Spanish crown or the Catholic Church because of hidden identities or activities could be arrested and tried in a closed court of the Inquisition. After this time, 1630s, 1640s, 1650 or so, then the crypto-Jewish experience in the Americas goes dark, and we lose information, documentation of it, until we get into the late 1900s when we begin to see it emerge again. So the question is, did crypto-Jewish life survive? This is like the black box experiments in psychology, in which we can document what went into the black box in the 1650s, and we can document what came out of the black box in the 1950s, but we have very little information about what happened in the period in between. In the last decades of 1900s, people became much more vocal about the memories in their families and the Jewish-like practices of lighting candles on Friday night, not eating pork, not working on Saturday, covering mirrors, and so on. People began to be more open that their families had a tradition of identifying as Jews. Anthropologists, historians, genealogists, and others began documenting the oral traditions, the genealogies, the Jewish-like practices. This was not a movement limited to people in the mountains of northern New Mexico, but without having had contact with each other, groups of people in Texas came forward with the same accounts about their families. Then families in Monterrey, Mexico, and other parts of that country came forward. Hundreds and into the thousands of people from Costa Rica to Colombia Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil have identified themselves as descendants of Jewish ancestors with a desire to reclaim the Jewish heritage. This Jewish identity movement continues to grow as more information about the crypto-Jewish experience has become available through the internet and social media. More people have identified with the movement. One of the interesting things that should be mentioned here, and that I talk about in the book, is that the internet, social media played such an important role in this. In Latin America, before the internet, there was almost no information about the crypto-Jewish experience. Little information about the Inquisition, or the whole problem with the Jews. That was not a thing that there was commonly information on. The rise of the internet, which suddenly made all this information available, has had a very interesting impact on the emergence of this movement across Latin America, as people now know that it exists, and the people from other parts are reclaiming their Jewish identity. So one of the challenging questions is, how did the memory of being Jewish survive in these families for hundreds of years without contact with the Jewish community? Some did form circles of acquaintances who had similar backgrounds, and there are indications that marriages did occur between these families. So there were threads of contact there, and there are other examples of religious groups surviving in hiding and isolation. So it does happen. At the same time that crypto-Jews were hiding from the Inquisition in the Americas, in Japan, we have an interesting group. The Kakuri Kirishitans were a Christian group that survived in hiding while being banned by the Tokugawa rulers from 1603 until the late 1800s, time period close to matching the one of the crypto-Jewish experience. And the interesting thing today, after the ban was lifted on this Christian group, it's permissible to be Christian in Japan again, starting the late 1800s. But this group has continued to exist. They had developed their own version of Christianity in hiding, and even though they no longer have to hide, there are still tens of thousands of people who follow that practice in Japan today. Culture and culture memory can be deeply rooted in human behavior, and it can survive in the structure of behavior over long periods of time. So the maintenance of Jewish memory and behavior among crypto-Jews from 1492 to 1650 is fairly clear, can be traced. There's little question about those years. What is remarkable is that after centuries in hiding, significant numbers of people from Latin American countries began to come forward in the late 1900s, self-identifying as Jews with references to their family having kept the memory of being Jewish. And I'd like to read from the experience of one of those who discovered the Jewish heritage of his family and reclaimed it. It's Rabbi Juan Mejia, and he describes his experience this way, in his words, I quote, "When I was 15, while celebrating Christmas with my family, my grandfather revealed that we had Jewish roots, much to the astonishment of all. He didn't know much, just that in his childhood in the hacienda, he had seen that the men would meet twice a day in a special room and prayed with towels on their heads from tiny books in a strange language. Later in life, he had confronted his relatives about this strange tradition, and they confessed to him openly that they were indeed Jews. This revelation started me on a journey," he says, quote, "this revelation started me on a journey that would end in Jerusalem many years later. While studying philosophy in the National University of Columbia, I became fascinated with medieval thought and started to read the works of Maimonides and to find out more about the Jews of Spain and what became of them. The knowledge that the blood in my veins had somehow participated in the splendorous golden age of Sepharad made me incredibly proud, although at that time I did not consider the option of converting. Only many years later, while taking a backpacking trip across Europe, did I find my way to the land of my ancestors. I decided to take a detour and visit Israel. There, at the Western Wall, I realized the incredible injustice that had been perpetuated against my family and my heritage. I decided to correct the historical mistake and cheat the Inquisition by converting back to Judaism. End of quote. Rabbi Mejia went on to learn Hebrew, study in yeshiva, and then do rabbinical studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and today he's a practicing rabbi. In Rabbi Mejia's experience, you can see the human reality of the crypto-Jewish experience. After centuries of hidden lives in the Americas, when it seemed that all was lost and it had disappeared, these buds of Jewish identity began to appear across the Americas, like a plant that had gone dormant and suddenly sprouts with new life. The Jewish identity movement has sprouted and is growing across Latin America today. As people have learned that they can now reclaim the Jewish heritage of their families, this has developed into a spontaneous wave movement across Latin America to the American Southwest. I hope that you will find the reading of Crypto-Jews, The Long Journey, as fascinating as I have found the years of research discovering this incredible story and analyzing it to know how to reliably write the history to try to present it in a correct and a truthful way. So thank you for your attention, and let's go to the questions. Marcia Torabin asks, what role have genetic markers played in identifying Jewish heritage, genetic markers played, and how reliable genetics for making this connection? What is the definition of anoseme? Okay. Genetic markers. Genetics has been important in, we've seen it here in New Mexico. The BRCA gene is an indication of people who have Jewish heritage. And this is one of the factors that has been a part of it. In my experience with the working with people and interviewing people about their Jewish, reclaiming their Jewish heritage, I personally have not encountered that many people that have returned to Judaism because of carrying the gene. But I know that that has been a meaningful matter for many people. And so that is an important marker. We see it in northern New Mexico into southern Colorado, for example, in this area. It's been less of an issue in Latin America, but it definitely is here. And the definition of anoseme. Anoseme is the Hebrew word for being forced. And in contemporary Hebrew usage in Israel, it refers to rape. In the Jewish experience in Spain, it referred to the people who were forced converts, like the ones I was mentioning after the preaching tours of Vicente Ferrer. Literally, mobs attacked the Jewish quarters, and out of fear, people did convert to save their lives and their families. There is another particular version of this anoseme, which is the most dramatic one that I talk about in the book. I didn't mention today, but in the book, the Portuguese experience is one that is particularly important. In Portugal, Jews, when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, many of them went into Portugal, a large number, tens of thousands, because you could still be Jewish in Portugal. But subsequently, through the young king of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel in Spain. They required him to expel the Jews before they would permit the marriage. He finally agreed to do it, but he made a ruse in which he called the Jews into Lisbon on the day that they were supposed to be leaving. And when, there were, we don't know exactly, maybe 20,000 Jews, maybe more, some say as many as 50,000. were gathered there in Lisbon. Um, Rather than providing ships for the people to leave Portugal and expel the Jews, he brought in priests and they declared everyone a Christian. They just declared them Christians without their consent. Um, I've tried to imagine how that might have happened. But there was a declaration. There were no more Jews in Portugal. There were only Christians now. Those people, that entire group, are called Anosim because they were converted against their will. They never agreed to it. That's the reason that later on, in the 1500s, we hear about crypto-Jews leaving Spain, but toward the end of that, Spain kind of vanishes off into the mist. All of the crypto-Jews then that are left are in Portugal. And then that's when we start hearing about the Portuguese crypto-Jews, the ones who went to Amsterdam. Most of the people who came to the Americas in the late 1500s and 1600s were Portuguese Jews, crypto-Jews. They were all Anosim. They were people who had been forcefully converted. And it looks like there was a very low percentage of loyalty among them. They didn't really become Catholics. They stayed crypto-Jews in a fairly high percentage. So Anosim means anyone who is forced. And in the Christian context, that's the issue. Okay, Edie, just a minute, let me see if I can read this. How about the first Jews that came to New York from Brazil? Yes, they were Sephardic Jews. They had gone from Amsterdam to Recife when the Dutch conquered that part of Brazil. So they were people largely who were originally Portuguese crypto-Jews. They had migrated to Amsterdam to reclaim their Judaism. And when the Dutch conquered Recife and that part of Brazil, then they went there. Recife became a majority Jewish city, by the way, the first majority Jewish city and the only one in the Americas. But then later the Portuguese conquered Recife, and they sent all the Jews back to Amsterdam, theoretically. But one ship got lost in the process, and through some different things that happened, the 23 people who survived were picked up by a French ship that was on its way to New Amsterdam. And so the 23 Jews that originally arrived in New York were Sephardic Jews of crypto-Jewish background, basically from the Portuguese crypto-Jewish experience. So that's a fascinating part of that history. Let me go further. Cesar Ayala. In addition to the classic works, okay, Cesar is mentioning some additional works that have been published in French and other sources. Yes. So Cesar is from the Department of Sociology at UCLA, and thank you for that. I don't know if other people can see this, but it would be useful. The Spanish Inquisition closed shop in 1834 in Spain. It had closed before that in the Americas. The American republics, as soon as they gained independence from Spain, one of the first things they did was abolish the Inquisition. So by the by the early 1800s, the Inquisition was being abolished in the Americas. How would you approach the study of crypto-Jews after 1834? Okay, that question has come up repeatedly. After the Inquisition was abolished, then why didn't the people who were crypto-Jewish come forward and declare themselves as Jews then, rather than waiting basically another 100 years before doing that? The best explanation I think that can be made for that is social pressure. The Inquisition had lost its influence, but Jews were being denounced from the pulpit in Mass on Sunday. Neighbors still thought it was shameful to be Jewish. So there was the shame factor. that I think came into play there. And it took a time before, it was after with Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council, when they actually declared that Jews were not responsible for killing Jesus, and that it was okay to be Jewish and they should not be proselytized. That was in the 1960s. We get the Roots movement coming in the 1970s. So some of those things began to happen in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, so that it makes it more acceptable for people to come out and actually identify. In the mid-1800s, it was still not acceptable because it was too shameful, I think. Etan Marcus by President Isaac Navon, yes, on the Anusim in Spain and Portugal. Yes, one of the outstanding works in this area, I didn't try to name the works here. In the book, there's an extensive bibliography and great information there. I didn't go into that so much here, but the President Isaac Navon of Israel did a great 3-volume work, as I remember, on the Anusim, and is important. Nathan Fox, what did you learn about crypto-Jews who fled to Italy via Portugal? My maternal grandmother was a hidden Jew whose family immigrated from northern Italy. She was very afraid when I returned to Judaism in the early 1990s. When the Jewish diaspora out of Spain spread across Europe into Italy, the Muslim lands, particularly Morocco, the Ottoman Empire, into Poland, Amsterdam, later on eventually into England. And one of the interesting things is the migration into Italy. Don Isaac Abravanel left Spain with 10,000 other people, Jews, accompanied him, and they settled in Spain, in Italy. So Italy, interestingly enough, was the place, even though the Vatican was there, and it's the seat of Catholicism, but it was a place where Jews were not expelled as they were in Spain. And a very different Jewish experience developed there. Jews who went to Italy as crypto-Jews very well would have continued hiding and continued with the fear. The fear you talk about with your grandmother sounds like the fear. Crypto-Judaism became crypto-Jews had a culture it was partly Jewish, but a large part of it was also hiding. It was the culture of hiding because of the fear. And that fear factor and the hiding factor continued. And many people coming to that experience today still have that part of their experience. Rachel Bortnick. So good to see you, Rachel. And a question. Rachel is, by the way, one of the people, if you want to learn Judeo-Spanish, she is a leader in preserving the speaking of Judeo-Spanish. Rachel Bortnick in Dallas. Has there been any attempt of the returning crypto-Jews to make contact with Sephardim who have lived full Jewish since they left Spain and Portugal, namely in the Ottoman Empire in North Africa? I think this is one of the gaps in the experience with people coming out of crypto-Judaism that I have seen. The natural, it would seem that the natural ally in a way would be the people of Sephardic descent, the cousins, because the people of Sephardic descent are the ones who were in Spain but chose to leave Spain at that point, and the Sephardic life really has been maintained, perhaps in a most complete way, in Morocco, North Africa, and in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire. That present doesn't exist here, like in the American Southwest. So it does exist in Mexico City, It does exist in Bogota, in Colombia. There are Sephardic synagogues there. Um, but I have not yet seen that connection being made that you would think that might be the case. But yeah, a very good point. Oh, that there, Claudia Sanchez is mentioning that there was a Carvajal who was a slaver of Native Americans. Um, it very well could be. Not all Carvajal were of Jewish descent, although that was a prominent name in Jewish circles. Um, so and there are cases very clearly where there were Jews in this time period who were involved in the slave trade, particularly coming out of the Portuguese background. Because remember, it was the Portuguese who really started and initiated, in a sense, the slave trade, because they had all the African colonies, all the African ports, and they had Brazil, where they had taken the sugar cane. So they were the ones that started this connection of slaving between with African labor and sugar cane in the Americas. Um, Judith Lesnov, I have heard that many Jews kept the keys to their homes in Spain after expulsion. Has there ever been a discussion about financial retribution by the Spanish government? No. The story of the key is a very famous one, and many families had those keys. The Spanish government, the retribution they decided to make was the law they passed in 2015 to give citizenship to anyone who could demonstrate that their ancestors had been expelled from Spain or had been persecuted or arrested by the Inquisition and so on. So if you can, so that was the retribution, that Spain would give citizenship again. The loss of houses and businesses, there has never been any discussion of retribution there. Is Anusim and crypto-Jew considered the same? Yes. Well, Anusim simply means someone who is forced to convert. If the person was forced to convert, but they continued Jewish practices, then they would be a crypto-Jew. So Anusim and crypto-Jew is not synonymous, but there was a very high percentage probably of people who were Anusim then becoming crypto-Jews. But it's not exactly the same thing. Tim Rivera, what is currently the attitude toward crypto-Jews and conversos from the larger Jewish community toward their discovery of the Sephardic heritage? One of the problems is that there has been a difficulty of connection between the established Jewish communities and the Jews who are returning to Judaism. For example, in Latin America, I'm going to mention Latin American cases, Colombia and Brazil particularly, which we haven't seen here. But they're, given the problems of people returning from crypto-Judaism, entering into established Jewish communities, what people have been doing is setting up their own synagogues. And in the suburbs of Medellin, Colombia, for example, in the suburb of Bello, there is a complete community of people who have returned to Judaism. They set up their own synagogue, sent a person to Israel to study to be a rabbi. They have kosher bakery, the Jewish school. They have Hebrew classes for the adults. They have a full functioning Jewish community set up by people who have returned to Judaism. Now, in Brazil, we find the same case. There are actually synagogues, and as I've been reading about these, I simply started calling them, at least the ones in Brazil, are very clearly just rogue synagogues. They don't have the acceptance of the established Jewish community, but there are people who want to claim the Jewish identity, so they set up their own synagogue and have their. In Brazil, they've been less accurate about having the standard Jewish training for the rabbi, but so the process is not always the same. But that is an issue. In our region, the United States, the synagogue that has been most welcoming to returning Jews is B'nai Zion in El Paso. And the membership there now has become majority of people who are returning to Judaism. People have learned Hebrew. The people who actually lead the services there, John Garcia leads the services. He's fluent in Hebrew, and he's of a returning family. So you have different dynamics going on, but this has been a continuing issue. Beverly asked about the Spanish names that end in Z. There is the comment frequently that any Spanish name that ends in Z, easy, like Martinez, Rodriguez, so on, are Jewish names. The actual fact is these are Spanish names. Jews can carry those names, Christians can carry them. It's not necessarily an indication of being Jewish. That in actual fact, EZ is an adaptation from the Latin. It's an evolution from Latin, which simply means the son of. So Rodriguez is the son of Rodrigo. Martinez is the son of Martin, and so on. So that is not necessarily a recognition of being Jewish. What happened quite commonly when people converted to Christianity, they actually changed their names to Christian names. Rabbi Salman Halevi in Burgos, for example, converted, very famous case, and he changed his name to Pablo Santamaria. So Halevi became Santa Maria. So there's a lot of name changing going on. The Jewish names very clearly are Halevi, Abravanel, Israel. There are clearly Jewish names, but Rodriguez and Martinez are not necessarily that case. And I think it's more than being about names. It's about heritage, practices, memories, and that sort of thing. I'd like to thank you for your attention and for being here, and I appreciate your interest in this subject. And one more time, we started the discussion, and this is about the book Crypto Jews. And I thank you for your interest in it and for being here today.